The brass bell above Goldstein's jewelers chimed once, brittle as a warning, as Helen Carver pushed through the door with her 5-year-old daughter's hand gripped tight in hers. Inside, the December cold gave way to something colder, the scent of polish and judgment, the velvet hush of a place that measured worth in carats. Helen's worn wool coat, patched at the elbows, whispered against the glass cases as she approached the counter. "I'd like to see the wedding bands, please," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter beneath her ribs. Mr. Goldstein, silver-haired, immaculate in his pressed vest, looked up from his ledger. His eyes traveled from Helen's second-hand coat to the scuffed shoes of her daughter Maggie, who stood wide-eyed beside a display of diamond rings that caught the overhead light like captured stars. "Wedding bands?" he repeated. Not a question. "And who's the groom?" "Thomas Brennan. He works at the steel mill." Goldstein's mouth tightened. "I see. And you're—" "A widow," Helen said, lifting her chin. "My first husband died in Vietnam. Tommy's been good to us. We're getting married Saturday at St. Mary's." What Helen didn't say, that Tommy had proposed with nothing but a promise and a heart big enough to love another man's child. That she'd been saving for 6 months, tucking away nickels and dimes from her shifts at the diner. That the small velvet pouch in her purse held exactly $43, every cent she had. Goldstein set down his pen with theatrical care. "Mrs. Carver, I run a respectable establishment. I don't extend credit to your sort. I'm not asking for credit. I have cash." He glanced at Maggie, then back at Helen, and something cruel flickered behind his politeness. "My wedding bands start at $120. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the 5 and dime." The air in the shop seemed to thicken. Helen felt Maggie's small hand tighten around hers. "I have $43, Helen said quietly. "That's what I can offer, for a simple band. Nothing fancy." "Then I'm afraid we have nothing for you." Helen stood there, heat climbing her neck, the weight of every assumption this man had made about her pressing down like a physical thing. She thought of Tommy waiting at the mill, his shy smile when he'd asked her to marry him in the kitchen of her tiny apartment. She thought of the vows they'd written together at her kitchen table, Maggie coloring beside them. "Please," she said, hating the word even as it left her mouth. "It's just a ring." "It's never just a ring, Mrs. Carver. It's a symbol of commitment, of stability." He closed his ledger with a soft thud. "I suggest you save your money and come back when you're ready to afford what marriage actually costs. Before we continue, wherever you are in the world right now, whether it's morning coffee or late-night scrolling, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. And if this story is pulling at something in you already, hit that like button and subscribe. You're going to want to see how this unfolds." Helen turned without another word, guiding Maggie back toward the door. But as the bell chimed their exit, Maggie looked up at her mother and whispered, "Mama, why was that man so mean?" Helen had no answer, only the cold December air on her face and the knowledge that in 3 days she would stand before God and everyone she knew and promise herself to a good man, without a ring to seal it. What she didn't know was that someone had been listening. In the back room of Goldstein's jewelers, a door creaked open just wide enough for a pair of weathered hands to grip its frame. Joseph Kaczmarek, the building's janitor for the past 22 years, stood in the shadows with a mop bucket at his feet and something ancient stirring in his chest. He'd heard every word, and in the breast pocket of his maintenance coveralls, wrapped in a square of faded blue cloth, rested a wedding band that hadn't seen daylight in a decade. The ring his late wife, Anna, had worn for 41 years. But here's the twist Helen couldn't have guessed. Joseph had been waiting, watching, listening to every customer who walked through Goldstein's door, searching for someone who understood what a ring truly meant. Someone worthy of carrying Anna's memory forward. He'd just found her. Joseph Kaczmarek had learned the art of invisibility long before he ever pushed a mop across Goldstein's polished floors. In the immigrant neighborhoods of South Philadelphia, where he'd arrived in 1953 with nothing but a cardboard suitcase and broken English, invisibility was survival. You kept your head down. You worked. You listened. And if you were smart, you noticed things that others missed. For 22 years, he'd been the ghost in Goldstein's jewelers, arriving before dawn to unlock the doors, staying past closing to sweep away the day's glitter and pretension. He'd watched engagement rings slide across velvet, watched young couples argue over clarity and cut, watched Mr. Goldstein's smile grow wider or thinner, depending on the weight of the wallet in front of him. He'd also watched Goldstein turn away 3 other women that winter alone. Always the same script, always the same cold arithmetic of worth. But Helen Carver was different. Joseph had seen it in the way she'd stood her ground, dignity intact even as humiliation colored her cheeks. He'd seen it in how she'd gripped her daughter's hand, protective, present, refusing to let shame transfer to the child. He'd seen Anna in her. That evening, after Goldstein locked the front door and counted his register, Joseph remained in the back room. The space smelled of ammonia and old wood, the fluorescent light overhead buzzing like a trapped insect. He sat on an upturned bucket and drew the blue cloth from his pocket. The ring inside was simple. 14-karat gold, slightly worn on one side where Anna's fingers had rubbed it smooth over 4 decades. No diamonds, no engravings, just a band that had witnessed a marriage built on war rations and factory wages, on 5 children raised in a 3-room apartment, on a love that had nothing to do with what you could afford and everything to do with what you could endure. Anna had died 10 years ago, in the winter of 1965. Pneumonia, swift and merciless. Joseph had slipped the ring from her cooling finger in the hospital room, wrapped it carefully, and carried it ever since, a talisman against forgetting. He'd told himself he was keeping it safe, preserving her memory. But the truth was darker, lonelier. He'd been waiting for a reason to let it go. The question that haunted him now was whether Helen Carver was that reason, or whether he was just a sentimental old fool, projecting meaning onto a stranger's misfortune. "Anna," he whispered to the empty room, his accent still thick after all these years. "Is this what you want? This woman. I don't even know her." The fluorescent light buzzed. The building settled around him, wood and stone exhaling the day's warmth. No answer came, but Joseph had stopped expecting divine clarity decades ago. Faith, he'd learned, was less about certainty and more about the willingness to act when everything in you screamed to stay still. He knew where Helen worked. He'd overheard her mention the diner. Morgan's, 2 blocks south on Allegheny. He'd passed it 1,000 times on his walk home, never once stepping inside. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would go. But first, he needed to understand what kind of man this Thomas Brennan was. A wedding ring wasn't just a gift. It was a promise witnessed, a covenant entered. If Joseph was going to give away Anna's ring, he needed to know it was going somewhere it would be honored. He stood, joints protesting, and tucked the cloth back into his pocket. Through the small window in the back room, he could see December snow beginning to fall, each flake catching the streetlight like a whispered secret. 3 days until the wedding. 3 days to decide if he was honoring his late wife's memory or desecrating it. What Joseph didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Helen Carver had already made a decision of her own. She'd resolved to marry Tommy without a ring, to face the whispers and sideways glances at St. Mary's with the same quiet strength she'd shown Goldstein. But she'd also made a promise to herself that if she ever had enough money, truly enough, she would buy a ring. Not for show, not for anyone else, but as proof to herself that she'd survived, that she'd built something lasting from nothing. That collision of intentions, Joseph's need to release the past, Helen's determination to claim her future, was about to reshape 3 lives in ways none of them could predict. Because in 3 days, when Helen walked down that aisle, she wouldn't be alone in her choice. Someone would be watching, waiting, carrying Anna's ring in his pocket like a prayer finally ready to be answered. Morgan's diner smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease, the kind of place where the vinyl booth seats were patched with duct tape and the jukebox only played songs from before the war. Joseph pushed through the door just after 6 in the evening, when the dinner rush was tapering and the overhead lights made everyone look tired and honest. He spotted Helen immediately, moving between tables with practiced efficiency, a coffee pot in one hand, an order pad tucked into her apron pocket. She didn't see him. He was, after all, very good at being invisible. He took a seat at the counter, where a heavy-set woman with a name tag reading Dottie slapped down a laminated menu without looking up. "Coffee? Please." Joseph watched Helen work. She moved with purpose, but there was a heaviness to her shoulders that hadn't been there in Goldstein's, or maybe it had, and he'd been too focused on the confrontation to notice. She laughed at something an elderly customer said, but the sound didn't quite reach her eyes. Maggie sat in a corner booth, colored pencils spread across the table, working on a drawing with the fierce concentration only children possess. "You gonna order or just stare?" Dottie asked, refilling his cup. "The meatloaf. Please." As Dottie shouted the order through the kitchen window, Helen finally glanced toward the counter. Her eyes passed over Joseph without recognition. Why would she remember the janitor from a jewelry store she'd visited once, a man she'd never actually seen? But Joseph recognized something else now, something that made his breath catch. The way Helen moved to Maggie's booth during a lull, checking the drawing. The way she smoothed the child's hair with an absent tenderness. The way Maggie looked up at her mother with complete trust, showing her a picture of what appeared to be a wedding dress made entirely of flowers. "That's beautiful, baby," Helen said softly. "You're gonna make me cry before Saturday even gets here. I want you to look like a princess, Mama. Princesses are overrated. I just want to look like someone your new daddy is proud to stand next to." It wasn't the words that struck Joseph. It was the gesture that followed. Helen pulled a small piece of hard candy from her apron and slipped it to Maggie with a conspiratorial wink, a tiny sweetness offered in a life that probably didn't have many to spare. Joseph's hand went to his pocket, to the cloth-wrapped ring, and suddenly he was back in 1943, watching Anna slip him the last piece of bread from her own plate in the displaced persons camp outside Krakow. "You need strength more than me," she'd said, though she'd been the one sick with fever. That small gesture, the willingness to give what you couldn't afford to lose, had been the moment Joseph knew he would marry her. He was seeing it again now, across 32 years and an ocean of grief. "Your daughter?" he asked quietly when Helen came to clear a neighboring table. Helen turned, surprised to be addressed. Yes. Maggie, she's 5. Good age, old enough to remember, young enough to dream. Something in his accent, or maybe the weight behind his words, made Helen pause. Do I know you? We met briefly, at Goldstein's. I work there. He didn't say janitor, didn't need to. The coveralls under his winter coat told the story. I heard what happened. I'm sorry. Helen's expression shuddered immediately. It's fine. We'll manage. I'm sure you will. That's not why I'm here. Then why are you here? Joseph hesitated. This was the moment, the hinge point where he either retreated into invisibility or stepped forward into something he couldn't control. He thought of Anna. He thought of the ring burning a hole in his pocket for 10 years. He thought of all the words he'd never said to his wife before she died, all the gratitude he'd assumed he'd have time to express. I want to give you something, he said, for your wedding. But first I need to ask you about the groom, this Thomas Brennan. What kind of man is he? Helen's defenses went up like walls. That's none of your business. You're right, it's not. Joseph pulled out the cloth and set it gently on the counter between them. But this was my wife's ring. She wore it for 41 years. And if I'm going to give it away, I need to know it's going to someone who understands what it means. Helen stared at the small bundle of blue fabric, not touching it. I don't understand. My Anna, she believed a ring wasn't about money. It was about witness. About a promise made in front of people who would hold you accountable when things got hard. He unwrapped the cloth slowly, revealing the simple gold band. She also believed that goodness should be rewarded. And what I saw in Goldstein's, what you did, standing up for yourself while protecting your daughter from shame, that was good. The diner seemed to hold its breath. Even Dottie had stopped wiping down tables. I can't accept this, Helen whispered. Why not? Because I don't know you. Because it's too much. Because, her voice cracked, because I don't deserve it. There it was, the wound beneath the armor. Joseph had seen it in Anna too. In those early days when she couldn't believe someone would choose her, would see value in a woman who'd survived a war by doing things she'd never speak of. He'd learned then that the cruelest legacy of hardship wasn't the scars you could see. It was the voice it planted in your head, telling you that struggle was all you'd ever earned. Tell me about Tommy, Joseph said gently. Tell me why you're marrying him. And perhaps because kindness from strangers is sometimes easier to receive than from those who know our full stories. Or perhaps because she was simply too tired to hold it in anymore, Helen told him. Tommy Brennan had walked into Morgan's diner on a Tuesday in March, Helen told Joseph, his work shirt still dusty from the mill, his hands scrubbed raw but still carrying the ghost of steel and heat. He'd ordered the special, pot roast and coffee, and left $1 tip on a $3 meal. Helen had chased him down the sidewalk to tell him he'd made a mistake, that the tip was nearly as much as the food. No mistake, he'd said, grinning. You looked like you could use a good day. He came back every Tuesday after that. Same order, same generous tip. And slowly, over burnt coffee and small talk, Helen had learned his story. Tommy had been married before, briefly, to his high school sweetheart. She'd left him after 2 years, unable to handle the shift work and the smell of the mill that clung to his clothes, no matter how many times he washed them. No children, no drama. Just a quiet dissolving of a promise that had been made too young. He's lonely, Helen said softly, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. But he's not desperate. There's a difference. He chose us, me and Maggie, not because he needed saving, but because he wanted to build something real. "And you?" Joseph asked. "What do you want?" Helen looked toward the corner booth where Maggie had fallen asleep over her drawings, her small cheek pressed against a crayon-drawn wedding dress. "I want Maggie to see what a good man looks like. I want her to know that love doesn't have to hurt, that it can be steady and plain and still be everything." The way she said it, with the weight of someone who'd learned the opposite first, told Joseph more than her words ever could. "Your first husband," he said carefully. "Vietnam?" "Officially, yes. They sent him home in a box with a flag and a letter thanking me for his service." Helen's voice went flat, the way voices do when they're holding back an ocean. "But the truth is, he died years before that. The man I married left for basic training and never came back. What returned was something else. Angry, haunted, mean when he drank, which was always." She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "He never hit Maggie. That was my line, and he knew it. But he hit me. And toward the end, before he deployed again, he told me I was lucky he bothered coming home at all, that no one else would ever want a woman like me." Joseph felt something crack open in his chest. How many Helens were there, he wondered, walking through the world carrying shame that belonged to someone else? "My Anna," he said after a moment. "She survived Auschwitz. Did you know they tattooed numbers on people there? Turned them into inventory?" Helen's eyes widened. "I didn't know. I'm sorry." She wore long sleeves her whole life, even in summer. Not because she was ashamed, but because she didn't want people's pity. She didn't want to be defined by what was done to her. He turned the ring slowly on, the counter, catching the diner's fluorescent light. "When I met her in the camp after liberation, she told me something I've never forgotten. She said the war tried to teach her she was nothing, and every day she survived, every kindness she showed, was an act of defiance. That's beautiful. That's why this ring matters." Joseph pushed it gently across the counter toward Helen. "Because it belonged to someone who understood that your worth isn't determined by who tried to destroy you. It's determined by what you build after." Helen stared at the ring, tears sliding down her cheeks unchecked. "I can't take this. It's your wife's memory." "No," Joseph said firmly. "My wife's memory is in here." He tapped his chest. "In the stories I carry. In the man I became because she loved me. The ring is just metal. But in your hands, on your finger, when you marry this good man, it becomes something else. It becomes proof that goodness is real, that it continues." The diner was empty now except for Dottie, who'd stopped even pretending not to listen. She stood by the kitchen window with tears in her own eyes, a dish rag twisted in her hands. Helen reached out slowly, her fingers trembling, and touched the ring. The gold was warm from Joseph's pocket, worn smooth by Anna's decades of wear. "Why me?" she whispered. "There must be dozens of brides who need rings." "Because I saw you protect your daughter's innocence in the face of cruelty," Joseph said simply. "Because you asked for help without demanding it. Because you reminded me that love isn't about what you can afford. It's about what you're willing to carry." Helen picked up the ring, held it to the light, and for the first time since her first husband had deployed and left her alone with a colicky infant and unpaid bills, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved something beautiful. "Thank you," she breathed. "I don't know how to. Thank you." Joseph stood, pulling out his wallet and leaving bills on the counter for his untouched meatloaf. "You thank me by wearing it, by building a good marriage, by teaching your daughter that dignity is something no one can take from you. You can only give it away. He was halfway to the door when Helen called out, "Wait, will you come? To the wedding? I want you there. I want you to see." "I'll be there," Joseph said, and the promise settled in his chest like an old friend coming home. But what neither of them knew, what Joseph would only discover 2 days later, was that Mr. Goldstein had been watching from across the street, his face pressed to the window of his closed shop, witnessing the transaction with something cold and calculating stirring behind his eyes. And men like Goldstein didn't forgive acts of generosity that made their own cruelty visible. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of bitter cold that turned breath to fog and made the streets of South Philadelphia glitter with frost. Joseph woke before dawn, as he always did, and dressed in his only suit, a dark gray affair from 1958 that still fit, though the shoulders had grown a bit loose over the years. He'd polished his shoes the night before, pressed his shirt with the iron Anna had used, and now stood before the bathroom mirror, attempting to knot his tie with fingers that suddenly felt clumsy. The ring was gone from his pocket. He'd given it to Helen 3 nights ago, and the absence felt strange. Lighter, yes, but also unmoored, as if he'd released something that had been anchoring him to the past. "I hope I did right, Anna," he whispered to his reflection. His apartment, a single room above a bakery on Kensington, smelled like rising dough and old coffee. He'd lived here since Anna died, unable to bear the 3-room walk-up they'd shared, where every corner held her ghost. He'd told himself it was practical, economical. The truth was simpler and more devastating. He'd been hiding from grief by erasing context. But this morning, for the first time in 10 years, he felt something other than the dull ache of absence. He felt purpose. The wedding was set for 11 o'clock at St. Mary's, a small Catholic church on the corner of 4th and Fitzwater, where Helen had been baptized as a child. Joseph planned to arrive early, to sit in the back where he could witness without intruding. He was locking his apartment door when he heard footsteps on the stairs, heavy, deliberate, wrong for this early hour. "Mr. Kaczmarek?" Joseph turned to find Mr. Goldstein standing on the landing below, dressed in an expensive overcoat and leather gloves, his breath fogging in the cold stairwell. "Mr. Goldstein." Joseph kept his voice neutral, though alarm bells rang in his skull. "Is something wrong at the shop?" "You could say that." Goldstein climbed the remaining steps slowly, each footfall a small declaration of power. "I've been doing inventory, making sure everything is accounted for, and I've noticed some discrepancies." Joseph's blood went cold. "What kind of discrepancies?" "A gold wedding band. Simple, 14 karat. Worth approximately $80 at market value." Goldstein's smile was thin and sharp. "I remember it sitting in the estate jewelry case last month. Now it's gone." "That's ridiculous. I don't have access to your merchandise. You lock everything up." "Do I?" Goldstein pulled a small notebook from his pocket, flipping through pages with theatrical care. "Because I've been reviewing my records, and it seems you've been alone in the shop after closing dozens of times. Plenty of opportunity for someone in your position to help himself to inventory." The accusation hung between them like poison gas. Joseph's mind raced. He'd never stolen anything in his life. Not during the war, not in the camps, not in the desperate years after liberation when theft would have been not just forgivable but necessary. His integrity had been the one thing he'd carried intact through every trial. "You know I didn't take anything," Joseph said quietly. "What do you want?" There it was, the real question beneath the theater. Goldstein's expression shifted, revealing something uglier than mere greed. I want you to understand that there are consequences for making me look bad. That woman, Helen Carver, she came back to my shop yesterday, stood outside the window and held up that ring you gave her. Wanted me to see it, to know that she'd found a better man than me. So that was it. Wounded pride, dressed up as righteousness. She didn't mean, I don't care what she meant. Goldstein's voice dropped to something cold and final. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to go to that wedding today. You're going to tell Mrs. Carver that you made a mistake, that the ring belongs to my shop's estate inventory, and that she needs to return it immediately. If she refuses, I'll have her arrested for receiving stolen property. You can't prove that ring came from your inventory. Can't I? Goldstein's smile widened. I have records of every piece that comes through my shop. I have estate purchases going back 20 years, and I have a reputation in this community that will carry far more weight than the word of a Polish janitor and a desperate single mother. The slur landed like a slap, but Joseph held steady. If you do this, you'll destroy that woman's wedding day. You'll humiliate her in front of everyone she knows. Then she should have thought of that before she tried to humiliate me. Joseph felt something ancient and immovable rise in his chest. The same thing that had kept him alive when the Nazis emptied his village, when the cattle cars rolled east, when Anna had died in his arms and he'd wanted nothing more than to follow her into the dark. Dignity. No, he said simply. Goldstein blinked. Excuse me? I said no. That ring belonged to my wife. I have our marriage certificate from Poland. I have photographs of Anna wearing it. You have no claim to it, legal or moral. You're calling me a liar? I'm telling you the truth. What you do with it is your choice. Joseph stepped forward, drawing himself to his full height. But if you go to that church, if you try to take that ring from Helen Carver on her wedding day, I will tell everyone there exactly what kind of man you are. How you refused to sell her a ring because she wasn't wealthy enough. How you're using false accusations to punish her for finding kindness elsewhere. For a long moment, they stood locked in silent confrontation. The jeweler and the janitor, wealth and poverty, cruelty and integrity measured on an invisible scale. Finally, Goldstein spoke, his voice soft and venomous. You're fired. Don't bother coming back to the shop. And Mr. Kaczmarek? In this city, reputation is everything. By Monday morning, no one will hire you. I'll make sure of it. He turned and descended the stairs, his footsteps echoing like a judge's gavel. Joseph stood alone in the cold stairwell, his hands shaking with anger and fear and something else, something that felt almost like relief. He'd just lost his job, his income, possibly his future. But he'd kept his soul. And in 3 hours, he was going to watch Helen Carver marry a good man while wearing Anna's ring, and no amount of Goldstein's cruelty could take that away. What Joseph didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Helen had made a decision of her own. One that would turn this day into something none of them expected. St. Mary's smelled like incense and old wood, the kind of scent that carried centuries of whispered prayers and witnessed promises. Joseph slipped into a back pew just as the organist began warming up, her fingers pulling hymns from the ancient instrument with practiced reverence. The church was small, intimate. Maybe 60 people scattered across the wooden benches, their winter coats draped over shoulders, their breath still visible in the cold air despite the struggling radiators. He recognized Dottie from the diner sitting near the front. wearing a hat with artificial flowers that had seen better decades. A cluster of men in steel mill uniforms occupied one side. Tommy's groomsmen, Joseph assumed, still smelling faintly of the foundry even in their Sunday best. Maggie sat in the front pew beside an elderly woman who must have been Helen's mother, the child's legs swinging with barely contained excitement. No sign of Goldstein. Joseph allowed himself to exhale. The organ swelled into the processional, and Tommy Brennan emerged from the side door with the priest. He was exactly as Joseph had imagined, broad-shouldered, honest-faced, his hands scrubbed clean but permanently stained by years of hard work. The man's eyes went immediately to the back of the church, waiting for his bride, and the naked hope in his expression made Joseph's throat tighten. This was what love looked like when it had been earned through loneliness, when it came not as rescue, but as recognition. Then Helen appeared at the church entrance, and the small congregation rose as one. She wore a simple cream-colored dress, likely borrowed or made by hand, that fell to her knees. No veil, no train, no pageantry. Her dark hair was pulled back with a single white flower, and she carried a modest bouquet of winter greenery and baby's breath. But it was her hand that drew every eye. On her left ring finger, catching the pale light filtering through the stained glass windows, Anna's gold band gleamed like a small sun. Helen walked alone down the aisle. No father to give her away, no grand entrance. Just a woman choosing, of her own free will and hard-won strength, to say yes to something new. When she reached the altar and took Tommy's hands, Joseph saw the exact moment Tommy noticed the ring. His eyes widened slightly, a question forming, and Helen whispered something Joseph couldn't hear. Whatever she said made Tommy's face transform, surprise giving way to tenderness, giving way to something that looked like gratitude so profound it hurt to witness. Father Murphy began the ceremony with the old familiar words, "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." Joseph barely heard him. He was watching Helen's face, the way her jaw was set with determination, even as tears tracked down her cheeks. He was watching Tommy's hands cradle hers with the kind of gentleness that comes from knowing how fragile good things can be. He was watching Maggie lean forward, in her pew, completely absorbed, as if memorizing every moment for future reference. "Thomas Michael Brennan, do you take Helen Marie Carver to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." Tommy's voice rang clear and certain. "Helen Marie Carver, do you take Thomas Michael Brennan to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Helen opened her mouth to respond, and the church doors slammed open. Goldstein stood in the entrance, backlit by winter sun, his expensive coat billowing dramatically. Behind him stood two police officers, their uniforms stark against the sacred space. "Stop this ceremony," Goldstein called out, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "That woman is wearing stolen property." The congregation erupted in shocked murmurs. Tommy instinctively moved in front of Helen, shielding her. Father Murphy's face flushed red with indignation at the interruption. "Mr. Goldstein," the priest said firmly, "this is a house of God, and you will show respect." "I'll show respect when justice is served." Goldstein strode down the aisle, the officers following reluctantly. "That ring on her finger was taken from my shop's inventory. I'm here to reclaim my property and press charges against the thief who gave it to her." Helen's face had gone white. "I didn't know. I didn't steal anything." "Of course you didn't, dear." Goldstein's false sympathy was more cruel than anger. "You were simply the recipient of stolen goods, but I'm afraid that makes you complicit." Joseph stood. his legs trembling but his voice steady. That's a lie. Every head turned toward the back of the church. The ring belonged to my wife, Joseph continued, walking slowly down the aisle. Anna Kaczmarek. We were married in Krakow in 1939. She wore that ring for 41 years until she died. I have our marriage certificate. I have photographs. That ring has never belonged to you. One of the police officers, an older man with a kind face, stepped forward. Mr. Goldstein, if this gentleman has documentation. He's lying to protect himself, Goldstein snapped. Officer, I've known this man for 20 years. He's my janitor. He had access to my inventory after hours. He's simply manufacturing a story to cover his theft. Then let's see the proof, Tommy said suddenly, his mill worker's voice carrying surprising authority. You say you have inventory records. Show us. Goldstein faltered for just a moment, a hairline fracture in his confidence. I don't need to prove anything. The ring is mine and… Actually, you do. The kind-faced officer pulled out a notepad. Mr. Kaczmarek claims ownership with documentation. You claim it was stolen from your inventory. If you want us to make an arrest, you need to prove the ring in question is yours. Can you describe it? Serial numbers? Unique markings? Goldstein's mouth opened and closed. It's a simple gold band, 14 karat, standard estate piece. So it could be any ring, the officer said slowly, including this gentleman's late wife's wedding band. The silence in the church was absolute. Joseph reached into his jacket and withdrew a small envelope, weathered, carried across an ocean and through decades. From it, he pulled a photograph. A young couple standing before a photographer's backdrop in what was clearly pre-war Poland. The woman wore a simple dress and held the man's hand. On her finger, even in the faded image, a gold band was clearly visible. This is Anna, Joseph said softly, holding the photograph up for everyone to see. 1939, 3 months before the invasion. That ring has been in my possession for 50 years, Mr. Goldstein. Would you like to explain how it ended up in your inventory? The jeweler's face had gone crimson. This is absurd. I don't have to stand here and be accused. No, Helen said suddenly, her voice cutting through the chaos like a bell. You don't. She turned to Joseph, and in her eyes he saw something he recognized from his own mirror. The moment when you decide that protecting your dignity matters more than protecting your comfort. Mr. Kaczmarek, she said clearly, would you please tell everyone why you gave me this ring? Joseph had spent a lifetime being invisible, but in that moment, standing in the center aisle of St. Mary's with 60 faces turned toward him, he felt more seen than he had since Anna died. I gave Helen this ring, he began, his accent thickening with emotion. Because 3 days ago, I watched Mr. Goldstein humiliate her in his shop. She came with cash in hand, asking to buy a wedding band. She had $43, everything she'd saved from months of work. And he refused to sell to her. Not because she couldn't pay, but because he decided she wasn't worthy. Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Dottie stood up, her face fierce. That's true. Helen told me the same story that very day. He called her your sort, Joseph continued, his voice strengthening. He suggested she go to the five and dime. He made her feel small in front of her daughter. And when she left his shop, I made a decision. He looked at Helen, then at Tommy, then at Maggie's wide eyes from the front pew. My Anna, she taught me that we honor the dead not by hoarding what they left us, but by giving it forward to those who understand its value. This ring, he gestured to Helen's hand, It witnessed 41 years of a marriage built on nothing but love and endurance. It survived a war. It survived poverty. It survived every test that could break something made of mere gold. His voice cracked. And when I heard Helen defend her worth to a man who saw her only as money, when I watched her protect her daughter from his cruelty, I knew exactly what Anna would want. She would want this ring to continue witnessing love, real love, the kind that chooses partnership over perfection. Goldstein stepped forward, desperation replacing his earlier confidence. This is a touching story, but it doesn't change the fact. The fact, the police officer interrupted, is that you've made an accusation of theft without evidence. Mr. Kaczmarek has documentation. You have what exactly? An inventory list that may or may not include a ring that matches thousands of others. I know what I know, Goldstein said stubbornly. And we know what we saw, Tommy said suddenly. The big man moved to stand beside Joseph, solidarity written in every line of his body. My bride came home 3 days ago in tears because you treated her like she was nothing, because in your world, $43 wasn't enough, wasn't worthy. Other voices joined in. A woman from Helen's side of the church stood. Helen Carver is the most decent person I know. She works 3 shifts a week at the diner, raises her daughter alone, and still finds time to help others. If she says that ring was given freely, I believe her. One of Tommy's groomsmen rose. I've known Tom Brennan for 15 years. He's the kind of man who shares his lunch when someone forgot theirs, who works double shifts so others can see their kids. If he's marrying Helen, she's good people. More stood, the elderly woman beside Maggie. 2 men from the mill, a young couple near the back. One by one, the congregation rose in silent testimony, not to legal facts or inventory records, but to character, to worth measured in kindness rather than cash. Father Murphy stepped forward, his voice resonating with quiet authority. Mr. Goldstein, I've married couples in this church for 37 years. Rich and poor, young and old, every combination of broken and hopeful humanity you can imagine. And I can tell you with certainty, a wedding ring is not about ownership. It's about witness, about community saying, we see you choosing each other, and we promise to help you keep that choice. He gestured to the standing congregation. These people are witnessing. They're saying Helen Carver is worthy, not because of what she can afford, but because of who she is. And if you can't see that, Mr. Goldstein, then perhaps you're in the wrong business. The jeweler looked around the church, at the standing figures, at the officers who'd clearly lost interest in making an arrest, at Joseph's weathered face holding that photograph like a shield. Something in Goldstein's expression crumbled. Not into remorse exactly, but into the realization that he'd badly miscalculated. He'd expected shame to do his work for him, expected Helen to fold under public accusation. He hadn't expected a community to rise. This isn't over, he muttered, but the fight had left his voice. Yes, Joseph said quietly, it is. The officers tipped their caps to Father Murphy and left without another word. Goldstein followed, his expensive coat suddenly looking like costume rather than armor. When the doors closed behind them, the church remained silent for one long, trembling moment. Then Maggie's voice rang out, clear as a bell. Can Mama get married now? Laughter broke the tension like spring thaw, warm and necessary. Father Murphy smiled, returning to his place before the altar. I believe we were right in the middle of vows. Helen, I'll ask again. Do you take Thomas Michael Brennan to be your lawfully wedded husband? Helen looked at Tommy through tears that were equal parts grief and joy and overwhelming relief. I do. God, I do. And Tommy, do you? I do. Tommy interrupted, grinning. Sorry, Father, but I've been waiting to say that for 6 months. Then by the power vested in me, Father Murphy couldn't hide his own smile. I now pronounce you husband and wife. Tommy, kiss your bride before anyone else interrupts. Tommy gathered Helen into his arms and kissed her with the kind of tenderness that made even the cynics in the back pews believe in second chances. The congregation erupted in applause. Maggie ran forward to throw herself at her mother's legs, and Tommy scooped the girl up with one arm while keeping the other around Helen, creating an instant family portrait that would live in that church's memory for decades. Joseph remained standing in the aisle, the photograph of Anna still clutched in his hand. He felt lighter than he had in 10 years, as if he'd been carrying a weight he hadn't fully acknowledged until it was gone. Helen caught his eye over Tommy's shoulder and mouthed 2 words. Thank you. Joseph nodded, his throat too tight for speech. As the newly married couple walked back down the aisle, Helen broke away from Tommy for just a moment. She took Joseph's weathered hands in hers, the ring catching light between them. I'll take care of it, she whispered. I promise. I know you will, Joseph replied. Anna would be honored. And in that small church on a bitter December morning in 1975, a ring that had survived everything the 20th century could throw at it found its way to new hands, new vows, new witness. The story should have ended there, with triumph and community and love overcoming cruelty. But the world has a way of adding postscripts, and Joseph Kaczmarek's postscript was about to teach everyone in St. Mary's one final lesson about the true cost of standing up. The reception was held in the church basement, where someone had strung paper decorations, and Dottie had somehow produced a 3-tiered cake that tasted better than it looked. Joseph sat at a corner table, nursing a cup of punch and watching the celebration unfold. Tommy and Helen danced to a crackling record player, swaying more than dancing, really, while Maggie spun in circles nearby with the unself-conscious joy only children possess. The steel mill workers had loosened their ties and were telling increasingly loud stories. Someone's aunt was teaching a group of teenagers a Polish folk dance that bore only passing resemblance to the original. It was perfect in its imperfection, real in ways that Goldstein's carefully curated showroom could never be. Mr. Kaczmarek? A young woman approached his table, one of the church volunteers who'd helped set up. There's someone at the door asking for you. Joseph's stomach tightened. Goldstein, come back for another round? But when he climbed the stairs to the church entrance, he found the kind-faced police officer from earlier, hat in hand. Officer Kowalski, the man said, extending his hand. I wanted to speak with you privately. Am I in trouble? No, sir. Quite the opposite. Kowalski glanced back toward the street. After we left, Goldstein tried to file charges at the station. Made quite a scene, actually. But my captain, he's been in this neighborhood 40 years. He knows Goldstein's reputation. More importantly, he knows yours. Joseph's confusion must have shown on his face. You've been cleaning that jewelry store for 2 decades, Mr. Kaczmarek. Not once has Goldstein reported anything missing. Not once have you asked for a raise or called in sick. You're at that shop before dawn, and you leave after dark, and you've never given anyone reason to question your character. Kowalski smiled. My captain told Goldstein that if he wanted to press charges, he'd better have ironclad proof. Otherwise, it looked an awful lot like harassment. And Goldstein left. But here's the thing. Kowalski's expression grew serious. He's going to make good on his threat to blackball you. Men like him, they've got connections. They'll whisper in the right ears, and by Monday, finding work in this neighborhood is going to be hard. Joseph nodded slowly. He'd known this was coming, had accepted it the moment he'd refused Goldstein's demands. I understand. Thank you for warning me. I'm not just warning you. Kowalski reached into his coat and pulled out a business card. My brother-in-law runs a maintenance company, commercial buildings downtown. The pay's better than what Goldstein was paying you, and he's always looking for reliable men. I already told him about you. He wants you to call Monday morning. Joseph stared at the card, emotion welling up so fast he couldn't speak. One more thing, Kowalski added. There's a collection going around the neighborhood. Started with some of the folks from church, but it's spreading. People who've seen how Goldstein operates, who've been on the wrong end of his judgment. They're putting together money for Helen and Tommy. Wedding gift, they're calling it. Should be enough for a decent start. That's extraordinary. That's community, Mr. Kaczmarek. You reminded people today what it looks like when someone stands up. They want to stand with you. After the officer left, Joseph remained in the doorway, card in hand, watching the December afternoon fade toward evening. Snow had begun to fall, light, persistent, the kind that would blanket the city by morning. He thought about Anna, about the ring now circling Helen's finger as she danced with her new husband, about the life he'd built from rubble and grief and the stubborn insistence that kindness mattered even when it cost you everything. Had he done the right thing? Would Anna approve? He'd never know for certain. The dead don't offer affirmation, only absence. But standing there, watching snow gather on the church steps, Joseph felt something he hadn't felt in a decade. The sense that his life was still unfolding, that there were chapters yet unwritten. That loss didn't have to be the final word. Mr. Kaczmarek? Helen's voice came from behind him. She stood at the top of the basement stairs, Tommy's suit jacket draped over her shoulders against the cold. You're not leaving, are you? Just getting some air. Liar. She smiled, moving to stand beside him. You're thinking about leaving because you don't want to be in the way. Because you've spent so long being invisible, you've forgotten how to let people see you. Joseph couldn't argue. Tommy and I talked, Helen continued, about what you lost today. Your job, your security, what you gave up to protect us. I gave up nothing I wasn't ready to release. Maybe, but we're not ready to release you. She took his hand, the ring warm against his palm. This ring connects us now. You, me, Anna, Tommy, Maggie. We're family, whether you planned it that way or not. And family doesn't let family struggle alone. Helen, Tommy's shift supervisor is hiring. Maintenance work at the mill. The pay's steady, and they're good to their people. He already put in a word for you. I don't know anything about steel mills. You know about showing up, about integrity, about doing what's right even when it costs you everything. Her eyes glistened. That's all they really need. The rest they can teach. Joseph looked at this woman, this stranger who'd walked into his life 3 days ago carrying nothing but determination and $43, and saw something he'd thought he'd lost forever. Purpose. Connection. Home. I'd be honored, he whispered. Helen squeezed his hand. Good. Because Maggie's already decided you're her grandpa, and you don't want to disappoint her. She's fierce when she's angry. They stood together in the doorway, watching snow fall on South Philadelphia, while behind them, the basement rang with laughter and music and the sound of people who'd chosen each other, despite everything the world said about worth and belonging. 6 months later, Joseph Kaczmarek would walk Maggie down the aisle at her school's father-daughter dance because Tommy was working overtime and Helen was recovering from pneumonia. He'd wear the same gray suit, freshly pressed, and Maggie would wear a dress the color of sunshine and tell everyone who'd listen that this was her Grandpa Joe, and he was a hero. 10 years later, he'd hold Helen and Tommy's newborn son, a surprise pregnancy that defied the doctor's predictions, and whisper Polish lullabies that Anna had sung to their own children decades before. 20 years later, at his retirement party from the steel mill, they'd present him with a plaque and a gold watch, and Tommy would give a speech about the man who taught him that character isn't what you do when people are watching. It's what you do when standing up means losing everything. But in that December doorway, with snow falling and a wedding celebration warming the air behind them, Joseph simply stood beside a woman who'd needed a ring and found a family instead. And that was enough. More than enough. Some people in South Philadelphia still tell the story of the janitor who stood up to Goldstein's jewelers, though the details shift with each telling. Some say the ring was worth thousands. Others claim Goldstein went bankrupt within the year. A few swear Joseph was actually a Polish prince in hiding, though that part's pure fantasy. But there's one detail everyone agrees on. If you ever pass a simple gold band on someone's hand and wonder about its story, remember that the most precious things aren't bought. They're given by people who understand that love isn't about what you can afford, but what you're willing to carry forward. If this story reminded you why kindness matters, hit that like button and subscribe. And in the comments, tell us, what's the most meaningful gift you've ever received? Not because of its price, but because of what it meant. We read every single comment, and your stories matter.